Betrayals that shattered trust, secrets that tore lives apart, and obsessions that turned deadly. Welcome to the dark side of love and loyalty. Dive into the untold stories where passion meets peril, and truth becomes the ultimate betrayal. The air was thick with heat that morning in Virginia, the sun relentless as it bore down on the suburban streets. Beads of sweat gathered at my temple, yet my determination remained unshaken as I stood in front of the brick house that marked the beginning of a new chapter. This wasn't just another job, it was a chance to rewrite my story, to prove to myself, and to my family back in Bala, Jordan, that I could build a life far from the familiar rhythm of home. In Bala, my life had been predictable, tied to traditions and a close-knit community. Here, at 33, I was stepping into uncharted territory. Unmarried and independent, I had defied expectations, leaving behind a world where women like me rarely ventured alone. This wasn't just about earning a living, it was about carving out a space for myself, no matter how daunting the challenge. The Jacobs family welcomed me with open arms, or so it seemed. Brianna Jacobs, the matriarch, exuded polished sophistication. Her blonde hair was always perfectly coiffed, her outfits tailored to perfection, and her demeanor sharp yet poised. Her words were kind but calculated, each one delivered with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Her husband, Zach Jacobs, was her opposite in many ways. Where Brianna was commanding, Zach was disarmingly approachable. His sandy brown hair framed a face marked by laughter lines and a warmth that felt genuine. His presence was steady, his kindness understated but undeniable. Their children, Splendor and Emmanuel, brought life to the house. Splendor, the inquisitive 5-year-old, was full of endless questions, while Emmanuel, just 3, was a bundle of mischievous energy. Their laughter echoed through the halls, adding a chaotic charm to the otherwise pristine home. From the moment I arrived, Brianna's attention to detail was evident. She handed me a binder, thick and meticulously organized, with schedules, rules, and even instructions on folding laundry. "This should help you get started," she said with a smile that hinted at both encouragement and expectation. I nodded, vowing to meet her standards, though I couldn't help but feel a flicker of doubt. Could I really keep up? The first few weeks settled into a predictable rhythm. My days began at dawn, preparing breakfast, packing lunches, and chasing after Emmanuel while Splendor peppered me with endless curiosity. By night, I would retreat to the small basement room that now served as my sanctuary, a modest space, but one I could call my own. Then, one day, the routine shifted. I was crouched on the kitchen floor, cleaning up a juice spill Emmanuel had gleefully created, when I felt it, a gaze. I looked up to find Zach leaning against the counter, his eyes fixed on me. "You're amazing with them," he said, his voice low but sincere. Caught off guard, I managed a polite, "Thank you, sir." He smiled, a small yet disarming curve of his lips. "Call me Zach," he insisted, his tone gentle but firm. There was something about the way he said it, unassuming yet deliberate, that stayed with me. Back in Bala, a man speaking to a woman like this would carry an unspoken meaning, a signal of intent. But Zach? He seemed different. After that moment, I began to notice the small things, the way he checked on me, asked if I had eaten, or helped carry groceries without prompting. These gestures weren't grand, but they felt thoughtful, intentional. Meanwhile, Brianna's absences grew more frequent. Her corporate job demanded long hours, leaving the house quieter, the spaces Zach and I shared more intimate. At first, it was nothing more than shared laughter over Splendor's wild imagination or brief conversations about the children. But slowly, the boundaries between us blurred in ways I couldn't quite define. One evening, as I set the table for dinner, Zach lingered in the kitchen, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Don't you ever feel tired?" he asked suddenly. I glanced at him, puzzled. Tired of what? Of always taking care of everyone else. Of putting others first. His words struck a nerve. I hesitated before replying, "It's my job. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. In my culture, a woman's strength was often measured by how much she could give, how much she could endure without complaint. Yet here was someone acknowledging my effort, recognizing the weight I carried. That night, his words echoed in my mind, unsettling yet comforting. I tried to remind myself of who I was, a Jordanian woman, bound by tradition and faith. There were lines I couldn't cross, boundaries I had to respect. But even as I told myself this, a small voice inside whispered that life doesn't always abide by rules. And so, under the blistering Virginia sun, the stage was set. Brianna's absences created a void, and Zach's presence began to fill it, his kindness, both a balm and a temptation. What started as simple gestures, an extra hand with the dishes, a shared laugh, became moments laden with unspoken tension. In those fleeting moments, I felt both drawn to and wary of him, as if standing on the edge of a precipice. I knew I couldn't let myself fall, but the ground beneath me felt increasingly unsteady. I clung to my mother's words like a lifeline, "Aaliyah, the world will test you. Stay true to yourself." But even her voice, so steady in my memory, couldn't silence the quiet pull of something I couldn't yet name. That night, sleep eluded me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as guilt and longing waged a relentless battle in my heart. My thoughts drifted to my family, a home filled with my mother's whispered prayers and my father's stern warnings, "Stay true to your faith. Never forget who you are." I wanted to believe I was still that girl, the one who prayed with conviction, wore her scarf as a badge of pride, and never questioned the boundaries that defined her. But the truth was undeniable. I was changing. And the realization terrified me. The next morning, I resolved to keep my distance from Zach. I poured my energy into chores, keeping my head down and my hands busy, as if scrubbing surfaces or folding laundry could wipe away the feelings I couldn't control. By mid-afternoon, though, avoidance became impossible. He found me in the laundry room, sorting clothes with a single-mindedness I didn't feel. "Aaliyah," he said softly. I froze for a moment, then continued folding. "Yes? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I replied quickly, my hands trembling as they smoothed out a shirt. "Please don't shut me out," he said, stepping closer. His voice carried a note of sincerity that was difficult to ignore. "I know I crossed a line." "It's not about you," I interrupted, finally meeting his gaze. "It's about me. My faith. My beliefs." "I understand," he said, though his eyes betrayed him. He didn't understand. How could he? "I can't," I faltered, the words catching in my throat. "I can't do this." He nodded slowly, a mix of regret and understanding softening his expression. "I'm sorry, Aaliyah. I never wanted to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," I said, my voice trembling. "That's the problem." For a moment, silence hung between us, heavy with unspoken emotions. "I'll give you space," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Thank you," I whispered, tears burning my eyes as I watched him walk away. That night, I prayed harder than ever. Kneeling on the floor, I begged for strength, clarity, and the courage to stay true to myself. Tears streamed down my face as I realized the battle I faced wasn't just against temptation, it was against a version of myself I barely recognized. The following days passed in tense, but manageable silence. Zach kept his promise to maintain his distance, and I threw myself into caring for Splendor and Emmanuel. Crafts, baking, stories, anything to fill the hours and distract my mind. Yet, even with my hands occupied, my thoughts strayed to him. When we crossed paths, he was polite, almost distant. I told myself it was for the best. We could pretend the moment in the laundry room had been a fleeting lapse, a mistake we both regretted. For a while, the pretense held. Then came the storm. It was a Friday evening, just after sunset, when the rain began. Thunder rolled in first, rattling the windows and sending Emmanuel running to my side as I cleared the dinner table. "Don't worry, sweetheart," I said, scooping him into my arms. "It's just noise. Let's get you ready for bed, okay?" He nodded, clutching my neck. Upstairs, I read his favorite bedtime story as the storm roared outside. By the time both children were asleep, the rain had intensified, and lightning illuminated fleeting shadows across the walls. Heading downstairs, I expected to find Zach on the couch, unwinding with a book or his phone. Instead, I found him in the kitchen, a glass of wine in his hand, staring out the window at the raging storm. "You don't drink wine, do you?" he asked, sensing my presence without turning around. "No," I replied, hesitating near the doorway. "It's against my faith." He nodded, finally looking at me. "I thought as much. You're different." "Is that bad?" I asked, a nervous smile creeping onto my face. "Not at all," he said quietly. "It's refreshing." I busied myself wiping down the counters, but the weight of his gaze on me was impossible to ignore. The air between us thickened, filled with words neither of us dared to speak. "Aaliyah," he said after a long silence. "Yes?" I kept my focus on the task at hand. "Can we talk?" My heart sank. I turned to face him, bracing myself. "About what?" "About us." "There is no us, Zach," I said firmly, though my heart betrayed me, hammering against my ribs. "Then why can't I stop thinking about you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Zach, please," my voice wavered, betraying the storm inside me. "I know it's wrong," he said, his tone raw with emotion. "I know I shouldn't feel this way. But I can't help it. I see you every day, caring for my kids, bringing warmth into this house, and he ran a hand through his hair, frustration etched across his face. "I've never felt this way before." His confession stole the breath from my lungs. Hearing it aloud made it impossible to deny what was happening. "Zach," I whispered, my voice a mix of longing and resistance. "You're married. You have a family." "I know," he said, sorrow darkening his eyes. "But Brianna is always gone. And when she's here, it's like we're strangers. You're the only one who makes me feel." His voice broke, the words hanging in the air. I stood frozen, torn between everything I believed and the undeniable pull toward him. "Zach," I whispered again, this time as a surrender. He closed the space between us. His lips met mine in a kiss that began tenderly but deepened as we abandoned every restraint. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, the storm outside echoing the tempest inside us. We didn't stop at a kiss. That night, as thunder rolled and rain lashed against the windows, we crossed a line. Upstairs, in the dim glow of his bedroom, he undressed me with reverence, his touch igniting a fire I hadn't known existed. In his arms, I felt cherished and utterly free. For the first time, I knew what it was to be desired, not as an obligation, but as something sacred. When it was over, we lay entwined, the storm outside matching the rhythm of my racing heart. I should have felt guilt, shame. But all I felt was peace, as if I had found something I didn't know I was missing. Morning brought a cold dose of reality. Avoiding Zach's gaze, I focused on the children, the weight of my actions pressing heavily on me. Yet when his eyes met mine with a small, knowing smile, the rush of the night before surged back. And it didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, we existed in stolen moments, lingering touches, whispered conversations, hurried embraces. Each time, I vowed it would be the last. But Zach had become my addiction, and I couldn't stop. I didn't want to. He made me forget everything, my faith, my upbringing, the values I had once held dear. With Zach, I allowed myself to believe in the illusion of a perfect bubble, a world isolated from reality where we could continue our secret affair undisturbed. But deep down, I knew the bubble was fragile, bound to burst and leave devastation in its wake. The duality of my life became suffocating. By day, I was Aaliyah, the devoted nanny who read bedtime stories, cooked meals, and offered warm smiles to Splendor and Emmanuel. By night, I was someone entirely different, someone who belonged to Zach in a way I had never belonged to anyone before. One quiet evening, after tucking the children into bed, I sat in the living room, folding laundry. Brianna had left that morning for another work trip, leaving the house eerily silent. Zach appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a playful smile. "Do you ever stop working?" he teased, his voice laced with amusement. I looked up, unable to suppress a small smile. "Someone has to keep this place running." He crossed the room, sitting beside me on the couch, his thigh brushing against mine. "You're amazing, you know that?" I shook my head, laughing softly. "I'm just doing my job."